Shame doesn't come from enemies, it comes from people who knew you before the image was polished, before the crown, before the cameras learned where to point. And tonight, that's exactly where this story begins. Not inside a palace, not under chandeliers, but in a quiet rejection that happened long before Prince Harry ever stepped into Meghan Markle's life. Because here's the truth no fairy tale wants you to hear. Prince Harry wasn't the first man warned about Meghan Markle. He was just the one who ignored it.
Something strange here that's starting to become a pattern, and you can see it here in this video. Right after he says, "I found the love of my life," there is a weird pause of discomfort. You do not have to be a profiler or anything to see this. You'll feel it.
I'd now found the love of my life, and I now have the opportunity to start a family with her.
According to reports, Noelle was born in or around 1999.
The walls are closing in on Rachel Meghan Markle because I've been doing more and more digging, and the findings are shocking. And even her cousin, I mean, if you are fainted of heart, get yourself some sort of coffee or tea or chamomile tea to calm you down, because this is gonna be rough.
What I discovered was, of course, that she was hunting for a man in England from 2013, and she wanted wealth and she wanted fame, and she targeted. There's no doubt she targeted her.
Shame doesn't come from enemies. It comes from people who knew you before the image was polished, before the fairy tale, before the palace, before the press learned her name. Because here's the part nobody tells you. Prince Harry wasn't the first man warned about Meghan Markle. He was just the one who ignored it years before tiaras and titles. A quiet rejection happened. No headlines, no scandal, just a family that chose not to proceed. And once you hear why they walked away, everything that came after starts to look familiar. Because this isn't a breakup story, it's a pattern story. And once a pattern is named, you can't unsee it. So why didn't Harry see what ordinary people notice first? And that's the question that rattles the walls of this entire saga. Because royal scandals love drama, shouting, lawsuits, leaked emails. But this was something far more dangerous. Silence. No press release, no smear campaign, just a family quietly stepping back and saying, something here doesn't feel right. Before princes, before protocols, before royal protection officers and Netflix deals, Meghan lived in a smaller world. And in that world was a man named Giuliano. Not a prince, not a celebrity, just a relationship. And more importantly, his family.
I want him to be a prince or a princess, not knowing what the gender would be, which would be different from protocol, and that he wasn't going to receive security.
What?
It was really hard.
Every royal story pretends it starts at the gates. Carriages, smiles, engagement interviews. But the real chapters begin earlier, at kitchen tables with families who notice things institutions later document. Before princes, Meghan lived in a smaller world. Ambition without polish, drive without PR. And in that world was a man named Giuliano. More importantly, his family. Families don't overreact. They observe how someone handles disagreement, how loyalty works, whether relationships feel mutual or transactional. And according to accounts now resurfacing, they hesitated, not dramatically, quietly. Invitation slowed, commitment delayed, the future withheld. Because that kind of rejection doesn't come from jealousy. It comes from concern. Concern. That word keeps coming back like a ghost no one wants to acknowledge. According to resurfacing accounts, Meghan and Joe didn't end in a fiery explosion. There was no screaming exit, no public betrayal. What happened was subtler and far more revealing. Emotional intensity, followed by distance. Connection first. Withdrawal next. Families have a word for that. Instability. And that moment didn't stand alone, because what happened next followed the same shape. Here's where the story turns dark. Not loud, not explosive, darkly familiar. When the rejection came, it wasn't accepted as concern. It was reframed. Distance became misunderstanding. Hesitation became fear. Resistance became proof she was meant for more. Every closed door didn't end the story, it upgraded it. And that's the pattern. Rejection doesn't stop the narrative, it fuels reinvention. By the time Meghan entered Prince Harry's life, there were no loose ends, no messy overlaps, no unresolved chapters, just a carefully streamlined past, struggle without warnings, ambition without accountability. Old stories didn't follow her, they vanished.
Meghan began dating Giuliano, and the The couple got married after having a child when Meghan was almost 20.
The kind of history that invites sympathy, not scrutiny. And Harry was built to accept it. He didn't just fall in love with Meghan. He recognized himself in her story. A woman mistreated by systems, misunderstood by institutions. It mirrored his own pain too perfectly to ignore. For Harry, emotional truth mattered more than procedural caution. And that's exactly when the palace began to feel uneasy. Because behind palace walls, vetting isn't about scandal, it's about patterns. They don't search for explosions. They search for absences. Families that fade, relationships that end cleanly, lives that don't overlap, not crimes. Gaps. And once those gaps lined up, the story stopped feeling romantic and started feeling familiar. But even then, that still wasn't the strangest part.
Meghan is a trained actress. What she does is that she studies people. She's not a good actress, but she is a trained one, right? She's been doing it her entire life. And there was no doubt that she studied Princess Diana. She studied her mannerisms towards Harry when he was a boy and the way that she grabs her face. And this is the psychopathic elements of what she does.
And when this story resurfaced, social media lit up. TikTok stitching timelines together. Tweets saying, wait, this happened before Harry? Memes reading, red flags don't appear overnight. One clip kept circulating. Families don't reject futures for fun. Another post went viral. I'm not saying she planned this, but the math ain't math. Fast, messy, relentless. Hollywood loves a scandal, just not this one. Because this wasn't gossip from tabloids. This wasn't palace spin. This was ordinary people noticing extraordinary repetition. And inside the palace, the reaction wasn't rage, it was calculation.
I'll tell you why. What she told the royal family, what she told Harry, wouldn't have jived, wouldn't have been consistent with the truth.
Inside the palace, tone shifted. Not anger, calculation. Early hesitations were reclassified as indicators. Giuliano's family. The abrupt end with Trevor Engelson. Friendships that vanished without overlap. Not accusations, a trajectory. Harry didn't hear caution. He heard betrayal, and so he doubled down. Publicly, emotionally. Love became defiance. The fairy tale turned ideological. And once opposition becomes moral failure, there's no room left for warning. And that's where everything locks into place. Institutions don't study the past to punish. They study it to predict. Intensity, alignment, advancement, exit, reinvention. That arc wasn't unique until it entered royal life. Harry believed love could neutralize pattern. History says otherwise. Here's the truth in 3 lines. The first rejection came before royalty. The warnings were quiet but consistent, and patterns don't disappear when titles appear. So tell me, do you think Harry ignored the signs, or was he never ready to see them? History doesn't shout, it waits. By the time the realization crept in, it didn't arrive with rage. It didn't arrive with shouting. It arrived with something far more devastating. Shame. Because shame is what settles in when you realize the warnings weren't planted by enemies, they were whispered by ordinary people with nothing to gain. And once that truth lands, it doesn't leave. It echoes. Harry didn't wake up one morning suddenly doubting everything. That's not how this works. Doubt arrives slowly, quietly, in moments that feel too small to name at first. A sentence that doesn't line up. A memory that feels edited. A story that changes just enough to make you pause, then feel guilty for pausing. Because when love becomes ideology, questioning it feels like betrayal. That's how the trap closes. At first, every concern Harry heard sounded the same to him. Jealousy, racism, tradition, fear of change. The palace became the villain. The media became the enemy. Anyone who hesitated was labeled hostile. That framing was powerful because it gave every doubt a moral cost. And once doubt has a moral cost, people silence themselves. Harry didn't defend Meghan quietly. He defended her publicly, emotionally, absolutely. Each defense locked him further into the narrative. Love wasn't just love anymore. It became proof. Proof that he was different from his family. Proof that he had broken cycles. Proof that he had chosen freedom. But here's the brutal irony. The more he fought to protect the story, the less space there was for truth. Because truth requires overlap. And overlap was exactly what kept disappearing. Think about it. Lives usually leave traces. Friends intersect. Families cross paths. Exes exist in shared timelines. But in Meghan's story, chapters ended cleanly, almost surgically. Giuliano, Trevor Engelson. Friendships that once filled rooms suddenly gone without echoes. pause. Not explosive endings, just absence. And absence is louder than scandal. Inside royal circles, that silence didn't scream danger, it whispered predictability. Patterns don't announce themselves. They repeat, and repetition doesn't need motive to be noticed. Harry, however, wasn't listening for patterns, he was listening for pain. And Meghan's story spoke directly to his deepest wound, the belief that institutions crush sensitivity, that systems misunderstand the emotional, that love is always punished by power. In her, he didn't just see a partner, he saw validation. That's why warnings didn't sound like care, they sounded like control. So when advisors hesitated, Harry hardened. When family expressed concern, he withdrew. When questions were asked, he heard judgment. And that's where humiliation begins, not in public failure, but in private certainty that later collapses. Because once you've burned bridges in defense of a story, discovering cracks in that story doesn't just hurt, it isolates. Harry didn't just choose Meghan, he chose against everyone else. And that choice came with consequences no one could undo. The palace didn't panic when Meghan arrived, it documented. It watched the same cycle play out again. Intensity followed by distance, closeness followed by separation, unity followed by rupture, staff turnover, broken relationships, abrupt exits, always framed as persecution, always framed as escape, and always framed with the same ending: we had no choice. That's the line families hear right before futures collapse. Joe Giuliano's family heard it first, quietly, privately, years before crowns were involved. And they did what families do when something feels off, they step back instead of escalating. Harry never had that pause. By the time the cracks became visible, the stakes were too high. Leaving wouldn't just mean heartbreak, it would mean humiliation on a global scale. It would mean admitting the warnings weren't cruelty, they were foresight. And foresight is unbearable when you've spent years calling it hatred. So Harry doubled down again. New narratives, new enemies, new reinventions. Distance from family reframed as survival. Exile reframed as empowerment. Every consequence repackaged as proof. But history doesn't disappear just because you rename it. It waits. And that's the part that cuts deepest. Because when social media stitched timelines together, when old clips resurfaced, when people started asking why so many relationships ended the same way, Harry wasn't watching from outside. He was inside the story being dissected. Memes weren't just jokes. They were mirrors. Red flags don't appear overnight. Families don't reject futures for fun. The math ain't math. Each line chipped away at the armor he built. And here's the cruelest twist. The humiliation wasn't that people noticed. It was that they noticed before him. Ordinary families, kitchen table conversations, quiet hesitations. They saw patterns without power, without press, without palaces. Harry had access to everything. Advisors, history, precedent, and still couldn't see what they did. That realization doesn't explode. It sinks. It shows up in pauses, in interviews that feel rehearsed, in defenses that sound exhausted, in stories that grow longer instead of clearer. Because when you're protecting truth, it simplifies. When you're protecting a narrative, it expands. And that's where Harry stands now, caught between loyalty and awareness, between love and recognition, between the story he told the world and the pattern the world now sees. The warnings didn't come from tabloids. They didn't come from rivals. They came from people who walked away early, quietly, because something didn't feel right. And once you realize that, one question becomes unavoidable. If this much was edited out, what else was rewritten? Because patterns don't disappear when titles appear, they just get louder when the spotlight turns on. And history doesn't shout, it waits. Shout, it waits. Shout, it waits. Shout.